Hello everyone! From dramas to webtoons to novels, explore Korea's story with us. This is Who Reads Story. My name is An Sung-jin and I'm a news reporter. And today we have another guest back with us. We have two guests. We have cats roaming around the studio, so if you hear any noises or meowing, that's our guest. And obviously, Jack, you're our guest as well. Nice to have you back.
Thank you. I'm Jack Greenberg. I'm a writer and researcher, and I'm focused on modern Korean history, politics of memory. Thanks for having me back.
Right, as we see with our notes, we have quite a lot to talk about today. Yeah. And today what we're going to be talking about is a couple of days ago, last week, it was Korea's national holiday, and I'm sure you know what day it is.
Well, that's right. August 15th was Liberation Day. There's many exhibits about the history of the holiday and the people who were responsible for liberation. I was actually at one at the MMCA where
I see.
There's an original copy of the book we'll be talking about today. But you know, Sung-jin, liberation wasn't just handed to Koreans. It was something that many people fought for. They sacrificed, their futures, their fortunes, many things, not to collaborate, but to stand up for what they believed in. And, their courage and their spirit made it possible for our society today. Right. And it allows people to go out in the streets, rally for change. So this holiday is all about remembering them.
Right. No, thank you for doing that great explanation for us. And you, I guess, had firsthand experience about the piece that we're going to be talking about. Now, as you mentioned, 광복절 is what we call the National Liberation Day in Korean. It quite literally means regaining light, and it is celebrating the country's liberation from Japan. And today, in remembrance of the National Liberation Day in Korea, we will be talking about a special piece by poet Yoon Dong-ju, which is titled Sky, Wind, Stars, and Poems. It may also be written as Heaven and Wind and Stars and Poems, the discussion that Jack and I had before going live. And, you obviously, I'm sure, already had first-hand experience with the poem itself. Do you know of poet Yoon Dong-ju himself?
Yeah, of course. So he was actually born in the Gando region of Manchuria.
Right.
He spent only 4 years in Korea itself. So he embodied the national sentiment, both in his widely accessible works, but also in the life that he lived. And his life is something that people can relate to, whether they're in China, in Japan, or in Korea. So he became a national poet, not because of where he was rooted, but because his poetry and his choices, they really spoke to the collective experience of the Korean people.
Right.
And then in 1943, he ended up in Fukuoka prison in Japan with his cousin, Song Myung-gyo.
Right. Which is where
the two of them both passed away only a few months apart. And that kind of shows the harshness of the colonial experience.
Right, absolutely. You've already quite delved into it, but Yoon Dong-ju himself is quite a beloved poet within Korea, but as you mentioned, regardless of the background or the nationality of where you're from, I feel like for some of our viewers who are not from Korea, it may be unfamiliar in who he is. Now, for you as a columnist yourself, you've already delved into what life he had led. But, for those who don't know about Yoon Dong-ju, to briefly give a description, as you've mentioned, he had passed away at a young age of 28. And because this year also celebrates the 80th anniversary of Korea's liberation from Japan, I guess it's a little bit more meaningful to talk about the piece that's been written by him.
Yeah.
Now, to obviously first understand the piece that he has written, I guess it would make more sense to understand the poet Yoon Dong-ju himself. Now, to delve into the era that he has lived in, now it's mostly during Japan's colonialism, and in 1917, right in the middle of Japanese occupation of Korea, that's when he was born. And again, he has, lived up till 1948, which is, when he passed away in Japan. And he has spent, partially of his time in Japan studying abroad. And while Korea, studied in Yeonhee College, which is actually where I've finished my bachelor's degree, right, which is now Yonsei University.
Yeah, so he's quite interesting because he's not necessarily an ideologue.
Right.
He wasn't a socialist or a communist like many people. That was very popular amongst intellectuals of the time. But he confronted his era with words, and they were very determined words, even though they were simple. He didn't use flowery language to convey his ideas. He really addressed a world that was marked by violence and oppression at a time when nonconformity could actually cost you your life. But he did so in a way that sheds light on, doubt and unease while also offering hope and comfort.
Right, I think that's what's interesting. It also hints at his passion for literature, but you know, the fact that he spent so much of his time studying abroad in Japan is also quite, it adds on to his character and his quality. Now, the book that we will be talking about today is, again, Heaven and Wind and Stars and Poem. As you can see over here, we have the physical copy with us. Now, this actually hasn't been published while he was alive, so it wasn't published during his lifetime. And 1 out of the 3 handwritten copies have survived only, and it was published in 1948. And as we talked about before, you know, titles have changed, but the meaning itself still comes through.
Right. You know, he wrote most of his poems for himself. Maybe he shared them with a few close friends and acquaintances, but he wasn't really trying to impress anyone with his writing. He was, you know, in his own mind, trying to make sense of a dissonant world. Our world today is complicated enough with new technologies and conflicts. His world was much harder to understand in many ways. But like you mentioned, there's been various editions released over time, and although some spellings have been updated and there are small discrepancies between them, it hasn't really changed the impact, right? You know, the poems inside, they still hit with a honesty and an intensity, speaking across generations.
Right, it's just a matter of different editions, different titles, everything content-wise still stayed the same. Now, for you, Jack, I mean, in our previous episode, we already covered a poem by Hwang In-chan, who is a poet that's called the idol of the poets for his more or less, I guess, flowery languages, and he's also written lyrics for idols. And I feel like translating poetry within the literature realm is a bit more complex because you also have to understand the emotions behind it, the underlying meaning behind it, and the rhythm of the poem itself in the original language. And I think that's why, you know, understanding the value or the meaning of poetry is difficult. But what do you think about the value or the meaning of poetry itself?
Yeah, totally. Translation itself is an art form, and the translation is always going to be shaped in some way by the translator. I think, like you said, poetry is especially tricky because every word carries weight. It's different from translating a novel. You know, you have less room to really delve into context and fill out those missing things. You have to really think about the sound and the rhythm, how words flow, how they fit together. Then there's a cultural side. You know, some words carry different meanings and historical weight, and they don't necessarily transfer easily between languages. And on top of that, with poetry, often the poet leaves a lot of room for interpretation on the part of the reader. So then the translator, it's their job to balance that. They have to be faithful to the original poem while also leaving that openness. So every choice matters, and that really shapes how the reader is going to make sense of the poet's world.
Right. No, I think you mentioned great points because as a translator, you not only have to convey what the original piece itself was trying to deliver to the readers, but you also have to make sense in the language that you are translating it into, which is why I guess that's the power of literature in itself, because it kind of transcends borders regardless of what language it is that you are reading in. And now today we're going to be talking about 3 pieces, 3 of his most representative pieces within this book. And the first one is Forward. In Korean, it is translated, it is 서시. In English, it's Forward. And I will be reading it out loud. So these were all what my notes were for. The first poem is Forward. Wishing not to have so much as aspect of shame toward heaven until the day I die. I suffered even when the wind stirred the leaves. With my heart singing to the stars, I shall love all things that are dying, and I must walk the road that has been given to me. Tonight, again, the stars are brushed by the wind. Now, this is the first time I've read it in English because in freshmen, as we go into college, they're all given, all the freshman entries are given a book by Yoon Dong-ju. So I've read it then in Korean, but it's the first time actually reading it out loud in English. Now for you, Jack, what was it like reading it?
Yeah, it's different for me. I think for Koreans, it's something they're kind of familiar with. You mentioned getting a copy of it. I think many will also have encountered it in high school, maybe.
It is kind of a must-read book.
But I think, being the first poem in this anthology, it really sets the tone for it. And it gives us some insights into Yoon's self-resolve and the kind of person that he was and also wanted to be. He aspired to seek the truth, to act with kindness towards others, and really to go through his life inflicting no harm. He wanted to be somebody who could hold his head high and live without shame. So reading it, you really get a sense of his inner discipline and his moral clarity as well. How he measured himself not by outward success, but by whether he remained faithful to the ideals that he held himself accountable to. So in that sense, I think when we look back at his life now, he really did fulfill his ambition. He stayed true to his principles until the very end, and he refused to compromise, even in very difficult circumstances. So I think what this poem does is it encourages the reader to really reflect on their own values and the kind of person they want to be and the kind of life they want to lead.
Right, as you mentioned, it is quite a representative and a beloved poem by a lot of Koreans. And the lines, the first few lines, I suffered even when the wind stirred the leaves, so much as like a speck of shame toward heaven until the day I die, is just a very iconic line that most Koreans would have heard at least once in their life. And, to give a little bit more detail about the poem itself, it was written in 1941, right before he was going to graduate from Yonhee College. And after he graduated in 1942, he moved over to Japan and he entered an English language department in a Christian mission school. And I guess he had this internal struggle between, this intensifying oppression of Japan's colonialism versus his love and passion for literature.
Right. Yeah, and I think the next poem that I'll read kind of speaks even more to that. So the one I'm going to read is called Self-Portrait. And coming round the mountain, I go up alone to the solitary well at the edge of the rice field and peer in quietly. Inside the well, the moon is bright, the clouds flow by, the sky spreads, and a light blue wind blows. Autumn is there, and a man is there. I turn away because I hate the man somehow. Pondering over him as I set out to leave, I feel sorry for him, and I go back and look in. He is still there. Again, I turn away, hating the fellow. I think of him again, setting out, and begin to miss him. Inside the well, the moon is bright. The clouds flow by. The sky spreads out. A light blue wind blows. Autumn is there, and a man like a memory. And that was written in September 1939.
Right, so I guess the I within the person, the narrator himself, is probably the poet himself, Yoon. And it's interesting to see how, while you were reading it, the lines say, as if he's almost pitying him and he resents and even misses himself. What do you think all these emotions that he is trying to portray all imply?
Again, this was written during his college years, and outwardly, this was a very productive period for him as a poet. He was making new connections, he was encountering people in the literary scene, but, outside in the world, everything was not good and at peace. It was when assimilation policies were being ratcheted up, and Japan was becoming ever more aggressive. So, it was a time of personal growth, like I said, yet he remained unsettled, despite this appearance of calm and achievement. So I think it really captures how he was continuously being tested by conflicting values and his own struggle for self-understanding as well as self-acceptance.
Right, it's interesting to see how much serenity this poem gives, yet if you think about the background or what he was actually going through, it's the complete opposite. You had all these internal struggles, this outside Japan colonialism was again, oppressing the society, so we really see that contrast. And this poem itself was written when he was only 22, and I guess the line for me, I feel sorry for him, and I look back and he's still there, kind of stood out the most, because if it's as the line itself is almost as if he's kind of looking back at himself and talking to the audience or reading out the lines. just going to go through the comments to see if anyone has actually read the poem. Now, people have talked about that they're always moved by his sincerity, and I think that's something that comes out through the poems itself, and a poet who never fades with time, which is probably why so many Koreans are still familiar with the name Yoon Dong-ju, even, so many years have passed since he passed away and since he's written these pieces. Now, lastly, the poem that I will be reading is One Night I Count the Stars, and it's quite a lengthy poem, relatively, so I will be reading just the first paragraph of the poem itself. One night I count the stars. The sky that the seasons pass through is filled with autumn. I feel as though I can count without trouble all the stars in the depths of autumn. The reason I cannot now count all the stars being etched in the depths of my heart, one and two at a time, is that morning comes too soon. Night still remains until tomorrow, and my youth is not yet spent.
Yeah, the idea of counting stars in one's heart, it's kind of a very romantic expression, but I think for Yoon it's a way of cataloging his personal, meaningful experiences and really holding them close, reflecting on them and giving them space in his soul. And I think you'll see that what each star represents as you read further if you end up picking up the book.
Right. So, I've only read one paragraph of the poem itself, but, just as Jack mentioned, if you guys have the time to go through the poem, might as well read through the whole poem to see what Yoon was really talking about. For me, the last line stood out the most. My youth is still not spent.
Yeah.
And it does actually reflect his personal life as well, because he did pass away at a fairly young age.
He was still a youth.
He was still a youth. And now, I guess what's interesting to see is that the narrator himself looks up at the stars in the sky and he kind of recalls the things that he has missed. And he uses the metaphor of counting each star to really show the things that he misses or the resentment, which is why I guess, people and our viewers should go through the entire poem.
Yeah, we won't spoil it.
We won't spoil it anymore, right?
Yeah, but Sungjin, how do you feel the experience of reading his poetry in Korean differs from reading it in English?
Right, great point. I guess this all kind of wraps up what we were talking about because, yes, I've read the original version of it in Korean, but again, I feel like the translator has done a good job translating the meaning more or less. Though, interestingly, in Korean, I felt more of this inner conflict or hesitation that the poet tried to deliver, while as in English it was a lot more direct. It might be the language that the translator has used, but it does come out a bit more straightforward, and I think the metaphors that he uses do come out a bit more direct in a way. The emotions that he's trying to convey seem to be more straightforward. I guess.
That's very interesting.
Which is,
if you got this particular edition, it has both the English and the Korean poems. So, it offers a good opportunity for the reader to explore those differences. And it's also a good way to practice your Korean if you're learning still like me.
That's true. And I guess depending on when you read it also kind of matters.
Right, yeah. Different points in your life, it might resonate more than at other times.
Right. I read the Korean version when I was a freshman. I read the English version, just a couple days ago. So I am in a different period in my life, stage in my life, and I guess that also kind of changes how one reads a poem. And, for those that are more interested in the life of poet Yoon Dong-ju, there is a movie titled Dongju, Portrait of a Poet, and I guess this might be a bit more of an in-depth analysis of his personal life, and this movie itself was released in 2016. Again, it talks about him and his cousin Song Mong-gyu that Jack had mentioned earlier, and it shows how these two young fellows live in the same era, yet there's the struggle between friendship, their inner conflicts, and I think the movie does a good job really bringing that through, even though, this takes place 80 years ago. And Jack, as a columnist, as someone who writes yourself, what was it like to read Korean poems in English?
Yeah, it's always great to read something different. I don't normally read poetry, but I think, Yoon being a representative Korean poet, once you read him, it's kind of a door that's opening, and it gets you interested in seeing what other Korean poets have to say, lesser known poets, poets in the provinces, and how do they make sense of difficult topics of their times, and how do they reflect and mediate on Korean history. I think, when you look at the past through the eyes of a poet, it offers a unique lens, because you're not looking at history through an official statist perspective. You're looking at it through the thoughts, the inner conflicts, and the emotions of people who experience these turbulent times.
Right, you get a narrative frame of the poet himself.
Yeah.
You also get an insight of the personal background, the personal life that that person was going through back then. Which is why I guess these episodes, episode by episode, I always get a sneak peek into the literature or into content that I don't really often delve into. Just like you mentioned, I'm not a great reader of poetry. It's not something that I often read, but through opportunities like this, I get to read them again, revisit them, read them in a different language. And now for me, it was also a refreshing experience to read this with you, Jack.
Oh, thanks.
And it was also an opportunity for us to talk about, the importance of translating across languages in literature. And for our viewers who are, if you guys are familiar with Korean itself, you may read the original copy. If not, check out the English copy or check out this book. Like Jack has mentioned, it has both versions of the Korean and English. That's all we have for Who Reads Story on our episode about Yoon Dong-ju and his poem Heaven and Wind and Stars and Poem, or Sky, Wind, Star and Poem. I mean, as usual, we bring a sneak peek into Korean contents, Korean culture, like literature, webtoons, novels. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here with us,
Thanks
Jack.
for having me again.
And we will see you next week with our new episode on Who Reads Story. Don't forget to leave a comment and a like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye.